September 7th, 1996, 11:15 p.m. A white Cadillac pulls up beside Suge Knight's BMW on Las Vegas Boulevard and opens fire. 4 bullets hit Tupac Shakur. In the chaos that follows, the screaming, the blood, the sirens, there's one person who isn't there. Kidada Jones, Tupac's girlfriend, the woman he'd been talking about marrying. The daughter of Quincy Jones, the most powerful music producer in the world. She's back at the hotel, getting ready to meet Tupac at Club 662 after the fight. She's picking out an outfit, doing her makeup, excited about the night ahead, and she has no idea that in a car 3 miles away, the man she loves is bleeding out. By the time she reaches the hospital, Tupac is in surgery. And over the next 6 days, as he fights for his life and loses, Kidada sits in that hospital corridor, waiting, praying, holding on to a relationship that had just begun. A relationship her father had tried to destroy. A relationship that was supposed to be their fresh start. A relationship that ended before it ever really got the chance to begin. This is the story of Tupac's last love, the woman who saw a side of him the world never knew, and the 6 days that broke her heart forever. If you're here because you remember when love stories in hip-hop still felt real, or because you want to understand the person Tupac was when the cameras were off, subscribe. We're telling the stories that go deeper than the headlines, the human moments, the heartbreak, the truth. Hit that like button and let's keep these stories alive together. Kidada Jones and Tupac Shakur met in 1995 at a club in Los Angeles. She was 21, working as a model and trying to build her own identity outside of being Quincy Jones's daughter. He was 24, freshly signed to Death Row Records, angry at the world and still carrying the trauma of the Quad Studios shooting that had nearly killed him a year earlier. They shouldn't have worked. Kidada came from privilege, Bel Air estates, private schools, industry parties where legends like Michael Jackson and Stevie Wonder were family friends. Tupac came from struggle, poverty, a mother who battled addiction, a childhood shaped by the Black Panther Party's collapse and constant FBI surveillance. But something connected. Maybe it was that they were both searching for something real in an industry built on illusion. Maybe it was that Kidada wasn't intimidated by Tupac's reputation and Tupac wasn't performing for Kidada the way he performed for everyone else. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe they just saw each other. Really saw each other. And in 1996, when you're famous and young and surrounded by people who want something from you, being truly seen is the rarest thing in the world. But there was a problem. A big one. Quincy Jones, Kidada's father, the man who'd produced Michael Jackson's Thriller, who'd scored films and built an empire, hated Tupac. And it wasn't subtle. In 1993, Tupac had given an interview where he made disrespectful comments about Quincy and his relationships with white women. Quincy was furious. He reportedly told Kidada that Tupac was dangerous, reckless, a bad influence, that if she got involved with him it would break his heart. And for a while, Kidada listened. She stayed away. But in 1995 she met Tupac at that club, and everything her father had warned her about seemed irrelevant, because the man she met wasn't the thug from the interview. He was funny, thoughtful, vulnerable in ways that caught her off guard. And when they started talking, really talking, she realized he was nothing like what the media portrayed. Here's what most people don't know. Tupac apologized to Quincy before he and Kidada got serious. In early 1996, Tupac reached out, through mutual friends, through carefully worded messages, and said he regretted the interview, that he'd been young and angry, and said things he didn't mean. He wanted to make it right. Not because he was trying to win over Quincy for access or connections, but because he genuinely cared about Kidada, and he understood what it meant to disrespect someone's father. Quincy didn't accept the apology, at least not publicly. He told people close to him that words were easy, that Tupac would have to prove through actions that he was worthy of his daughter, and that created a tension that hung over the entire relationship. Kidada was caught between the man she loved and the father whose approval she desperately wanted, and Tupac was trying to be someone he'd never really been before, a man who cared what people thought, a man who wanted to do right by someone, a man who was tired of being the villain. By the summer of 1996, Tupac and Kidada were inseparable. They were talking about the future, about getting married, about building a life together away from the chaos of death row and the constant beefs and the violence that seemed to follow Tupac wherever he went. Kidada later told interviewers that Tupac talked about retiring, about moving somewhere quiet, about starting a family. He wanted kids, he wanted stability, he wanted to be the kind of father he'd never had, and Kidada believed him. Because when they were alone, away from Suge Knight, away from the studio, away from the cameras, Tupac was different. Softer, less guarded. He read poetry to her. He talked about his fears and insecurities. He admitted that he was exhausted by the persona he'd built, that sometimes he didn't recognize himself anymore. And Kidada saw through all of it. She saw the scared kid from Baltimore who'd grown up too fast, the artist who wanted to be remembered for more than beef and controversy, the man who was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. What do you do when you meet someone who makes you want to change, but the world won't let you? Tupac gave Kidada a ring in August 1996. It wasn't an engagement ring, not officially, but it was a promise. People close to them said he told her it was a placeholder, that when things calmed down, when he finished his obligations to death row, when he could breathe again, he'd get her a real ring, and they'd make it official. Kidada wore that ring every day. She later said it made her feel safe. Like no matter how chaotic Tupac's world was, she had proof that he was thinking about a future with her, that she wasn't just another person passing through his life, that what they had was real. And for a few months in 1996, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they could pull it off. Maybe Tupac could walk away from the violence. Maybe Quincy would come around. Maybe love would be enough. But the world had other plans. In early September, Tupac flew to Las Vegas for the Mike Tyson fight. Kidada was supposed to go with him, but at the last minute, she stayed behind in Los Angeles. She had work commitments, photo shoots, meetings that couldn't be rescheduled, and Tupac didn't push her. He kissed her goodbye at the airport and told her he'd see her in a few days, that they'd go to Club 662 after the fight and celebrate, that it was going to be a good weekend, and Kidada believed him. She had no reason not to. Tupac had survived so much already. 5 bullets in New York, jail time, betrayal. He was invincible, or at least that's what everyone around him seemed to think. So Kidada let him go, and she never saw him conscious again. On the night of September 7, Kidada was getting ready to meet Tupac at the club. She'd flown into Las Vegas that afternoon and was staying at the MGM Grand. She knew about the fight, Tyson versus Selden, and she knew Tupac would be hyped afterward. That's how he was after big events, full of energy, wanting to celebrate. She was doing her makeup when her phone rang. It was someone from Tupac's entourage. The voice on the other end was panicked, shaking, and the words didn't make sense at first. "There's been a shooting. Tupac's hit. Get to the hospital." Kidada later said she felt her legs give out, that the room spun, that she couldn't process what she was hearing because it didn't feel real. How could it be real? She'd just talked to him that afternoon. He was fine. He was happy. He was supposed to be at the club right now, not in an ambulance. She got to University Medical Center around midnight. The emergency room was chaos. Police, cameras, death row personnel screaming at hospital staff. And in the middle of it all, Kidada was just trying to get information, trying to find out if Tupac was alive, if he was going to be okay, if she could see him. A nurse finally told her he was in surgery, that the next few hours were critical, that she should wait. So Kidada sat down in a plastic chair in the hospital waiting room and waited. And over the next 6 days, that waiting room became her world. She barely slept, barely ate. She just sat there, holding on to the ring Tupac had given her, praying that the man she loved would wake up and prove everyone wrong one more time. When someone you love is dying, time does strange things. Minutes feel like hours feel like seconds, and every moment without answers feels like drowning. Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, arrived at the hospital on September 8. She and Kidada had never been particularly close. Afeni was protective of her son, fiercely so, and she'd been skeptical of most of the women in Tupac's life. But when she saw Kidada sitting in that hallway, eyes swollen from crying, still wearing the ring Tupac had given her, something shifted. Afeni reportedly walked over, sat down beside her, and took her hand. She didn't say much, just held Kidada's hand, And in that moment, they became connected by the same unbearable waiting, the same hope, the same fear. Over the next few days, Afeni controlled who had access to Tupac's hospital room. Very few people were allowed in, but Kidada was one of them. She sat beside his bed for hours at a time, talking to him, playing music he loved, reading him poetry. The doctors said he probably couldn't hear her, that the damage to his body was too severe, but Kidada didn't care. She talked anyway, because the alternative, accepting that he was gone, was unbearable. On September 10, Tupac's condition worsened. His lung collapsed. His organs were beginning to fail. The doctors told Afeni that the chances of recovery were slim, that even if he survived, the damage might be irreversible. Afeni made the decision that no mother should ever have to make. If Tupac didn't show significant improvement in the next 48 hours, she would remove him from life support. Kidada was in the room when Afeni said it, and she later described feeling like the floor had been pulled out from under her. Because as long as the machines were breathing for him, as long as his heart was still beating, there was hope. But once those machines were turned off, hope would die too, and she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to say goodbye to a relationship that had just started, to a future they'd planned but never got to live. Over those final days, Kidada stayed by Tupac's side almost constantly. She held his hand, she whispered things she needed him to hear. Apologies for fights they'd had, promises about the life they were supposed to build, confessions of love that she'd been too scared to say out loud when he was awake. And she waited for some sign, any sign that he could hear her, that he was fighting, that he wasn't ready to let go. But the sign never came. On September 13 at 4:03 a.m., Afeni made the decision to remove life support. Kidada was holding Tupac's hand when the machines were turned off. She felt his pulse slow, felt his breathing stop, and in that moment, the man who'd been the center of her world for the past year was gone. She was 22 years old, and the love of her life had just died in her arms. How do you survive losing someone when you're still holding on to the future you thought you'd have? After Tupac died, Kidada disappeared from public life. She didn't give interviews. She didn't attend memorials. She just vanished. People close to her said she was devastated, that she blamed herself for not being in the car that night, for staying behind in Los Angeles, for not being there to protect him. It's survivor's guilt in its rawest form, the irrational belief that if she'd been there, things would have been different, that maybe she could have convinced him not to go to the fight, or not to get into Suge's car, or not to stop at that red light on Flamingo Road. Of course, none of that is true. Kidada couldn't have stopped what happened. But grief doesn't care about logic. Grief just screams that you should have done something, anything, and Kidada carried that weight for years. Quincy Jones, her father, who'd tried so hard to keep her away from Tupac, was reportedly heartbroken for his daughter. He saw what the loss did to her, and in the years that followed, he softened his stance on Tupac. In interviews, he spoke about him with respect, with regret, with an acknowledgement that Tupac had been trying to change, that maybe, if things had gone differently, he and Kidada really could have made it work. But by then, it was too late. Tupac was gone, and Kidada was left to grieve, not just the man, but the life they'd almost had, the marriage, the kids, the quiet mornings and simple moments that they'd never get to experience. The hardest part of losing someone isn't the goodbye, it's all the hellos you'll never get to say. In the years after Tupac's death, Kidada slowly rebuilt her life. She continued modeling. She worked as a designer. She moved forward because that's what you do when staying still feels like drowning. But people who knew her said she was different, quieter, more guarded, like a part of her had died in that Las Vegas hospital and never came back. In interviews, on the rare occasions when she spoke about Tupac, she was careful. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't turn their relationship into tabloid fodder. She just spoke about him as the man she knew, the one who read poetry, who wanted to be a father, who was tired of being angry all the time, and when she talked about him, you could hear it in her voice. The love was still there. The grief was still there. The ring he gave her, she kept it, for years. A quiet reminder of what they'd had and what they'd lost. In 2017, 21 years after Tupac's death, Kidada gave a rare interview where she opened up about that final week in the hospital. She said the hardest part wasn't watching him die, it was the moments right before, when she'd sit beside his bed and wonder if he could hear her, if he knew she was there, if he was scared. She said she told him she loved him over and over, hoping that somehow, even unconscious, he'd feel it, that he wouldn't think he was alone. And when he finally passed, she said she felt both relief and devastation. Relief that he wasn't suffering anymore, devastation that the future they'd planned was gone. She said grief is strange like that. It holds contradictions. You can miss someone and be grateful they're at peace at the same time. You can love someone and be angry at them for leaving. You can heal and still carry the wound. Kidada also spoke about the guilt, the what-ifs that haunted her for years. What if I'd been in Las Vegas that night? What if I'd convinced him not to go to the fight? What if I'd been in the car instead of at the hotel? She said therapy helped her understand that those questions don't have answers, that she couldn't have changed what happened, that Tupac's death wasn't her fault, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things, and it took years, decades even, for the emotional part to catch up. She said she eventually made peace with it, not because the pain went away, but because she learned to carry it differently, to honor Tupac's memory, not by dwelling on the tragedy, but by remembering the love, the laughter, the quiet moments when it was just the two of them and the rest of the world didn't exist. Grief doesn't end, it just becomes part of who you are, and you learn to live with it, or you don't. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Kidada and Tupac's story is how little time they actually had. From the moment they got serious in early 1996 to Tupac's death in September, they had less than a year together, and most of that year was overshadowed by chaos. Tupac's legal battles, his obligations to death row, the constant beefs, the paranoia. They had stolen moments, weekends when Tupac wasn't in the studio, late-night phone calls when he was on the road, quiet mornings when they could pretend, just for a little while, that they were a normal couple, but normal was a luxury they rarely got. And now, looking back, those stolen moments are all Kidada has. Photographs, memories, the ring he gave her, and the knowledge that they were building something real, even if they never got to finish it. There's a photo that surfaced years after Tupac's death. It's a candid shot. Tupac and Kidada are at a party, sitting close, his arm around her, both of them smiling in a way that feels unguarded. It's one of the few images of them together that exists. And when you look at it, you can see something that the public rarely saw in Tupac: contentment. He's not performing. He's not the aggressive, defiant figure from music videos and interviews. He's just a man in love, happy, at peace, for a moment. Kidada later said that photo was one of her favorite memories, because in that moment, everything was simple. They were just two people who loved each other. No death row, no media, no beef, just them. And even though that moment was fleeting, it was real, and it mattered. In the years since Tupac's death, Kidada has rarely spoken about their relationship publicly. She's moved on with her life, married, had children, built a career. But every September, when the anniversary of Tupac's death rolls around and the internet floods with tributes and think pieces, people who know her say she goes quiet, that she takes time to herself, that she remembers. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how much healing happens, losing someone you loved that deeply leaves a mark. It changes you. And for Kidada, September 13 will always be the day the future she'd imagined disappeared. The day love wasn't enough to save him. The day she had to let go of the man who'd made her believe in something real. The cruelest thing about love is that it doesn't protect you from loss. It just makes the loss hurt more. Tupac and Kidada's relationship is often overlooked in the larger narrative of Tupac's life. The media focuses on the violence, the beefs, the conspiracy theories. But for Kidada, the story isn't about how Tupac died, it's about how he lived, about the side of him the world didn't see. The man who wrote her poetry, who talked about building a family, who was trying in his own messy way to be better. And that's the version of Tupac she wants people to remember. Not the thug, not the martyr, just the man, the one who laughed and loved and dreamed of a future he'd never get to see. She's said in interviews that she doesn't want people to pity her, that what she and Tupac had was beautiful, even if it was brief, that she'd rather have loved him for a year than never loved him at all. And maybe that's the real legacy of their relationship, not the tragedy, but the love. The proof that even in the middle of chaos, even when the world is trying to pull you apart, connection is possible, love is possible, even if it doesn't last forever. Sometimes the shortest love stories are the ones that stay with you the longest. There's a letter Tupac wrote to Kidada in the summer of 1996. It was never made public. Kidada has kept it private, but people close to her have described its contents. In it, Tupac reportedly apologized for the chaos of his life, for dragging her into the madness of death row and the constant threats and the media scrutiny. He told her she deserved better, someone stable, someone who could give her the quiet, normal life she'd grown up with. But he also told her he was trying, that she made him want to be better, that for the first time in his life he could imagine a future that wasn't defined by anger and violence, that he could see himself being a husband, a father, a man who built things instead of destroying them. And he ended the letter by saying he loved her, not in the performative way he said things for cameras, but in the quiet, honest way you say things when you mean them, when they're true. Kidada has never shared that letter, and she probably never will, because some things are sacred. Some things don't need to be dissected by the public, but the people who know about it say it's a window into who Tupac was becoming in those final months. A man who was tired, who was searching for peace, who'd found something real with Kidada and was terrified of losing it. And in a way that letter is the most tragic part of the story, because it proves that Tupac was changing, that he was moving towards something healthier, something sustainable. And then, just as he was starting to see a way forward, it all ended. One night, one car, one decision to stop at a red light, and the future he'd written about in that letter was gone. When people talk about Tupac's death, they often frame it as inevitable, as if he was always headed toward a violent end. But Kidada's story complicates that narrative, because in the final year of his life, Tupac was trying to change. He was in love, he was making plans, he was imagining a future beyond death row and beef and the constant cycle of violence. And maybe, just maybe, if he'd had more time, he would have made it. Maybe he would have walked away from the chaos. Maybe he and Kidada would have gotten married, had kids, built the quiet life he'd written about in that letter. Or maybe not. Maybe the forces pulling him toward destruction were too strong. Maybe the industry wouldn't have let him go. Maybe the streets wouldn't have forgiven him for walking away. We'll never know, because on September 7th, 1996, all of that possibility was erased, and Kidada was left holding on to a ring and a letter and a future that would never happen. But here's what we do know. Tupac loved her, and she loved him. And for a brief moment in 1996, in the middle of all the chaos and violence and madness, they found something real, something that made Tupac want to be better, something that gave Kidada hope that love could survive even in the darkest circumstances. And even though it ended in tragedy, even though they never got their happy ending, that love mattered. It changed both of them. It proved that Tupac was more than the persona he'd built, that he was capable of tenderness and vulnerability and hope. And for Kidada, that's enough. It has to be, because it's all she has left. The story didn't end the way it was supposed to, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth telling. On September 13th, 1996, Kidada Jones lost the man she loved. She was 22 years old, and the life she'd been planning, the marriage, the family, the future, disappeared in a hospital room in Las Vegas. In the years since, she's built a new life. She's healed. She's moved forward. But September 13 will always be the day everything changed, the day love wasn't enough, the day she had to say goodbye to a future she'd barely begun to imagine. And if you ask her now, she'll tell you she doesn't regret it. That loving Tupac, even for such a short time, was worth the pain that followed, because in those stolen moments, the late-night conversations, the poetry, the quiet mornings, she saw a side of him the world never got to see. And that's a gift, even if it came with unbearable loss. Tupac Shakur died at 25 years old, and in those 25 years, he lived more than most people do in a lifetime. He made music that changed a culture. He fought battles most of us will never face, and in his final year, he fell in love with a woman who made him want to be better, who made him believe in a future beyond the violence and the chaos. And even though he never got to live that future, the fact that he wanted it matters. It proves he wasn't just the legend. He was a man, flawed, complicated, trying, and Kidada saw all of it, and loved him anyway. That's the real story. Not the tragedy, not the violence, but the love, the hope, The brief, beautiful moment when two people found each other in the middle of the storm and held on as long as they could. Some love stories don't get happy endings, but that doesn't make them any less real. What's a relationship you remember from hip-hop that felt real, the kind that made you believe love could survive the chaos? Drop a memory below.